The first thing we should do is put the pieces on the board. A phrase to remember is white on the right and queen on her own color. You can see the white square is to the right, so let's put the queen on her own color. And next we have the rooks. Both players have 2 rooks, and the rooks go right in the corners. Next we have the knights. Once again, both players have 2 knights, and the knights go right next to the rooks. Just like that. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that a lot of people call the knights horses, I guess because they look like a horse. However, the correct name is knight. And by the same token, some people call the rooks castles because they resemble the top of a castle. However, the correct name is rook. Next we'll put on the bishops. Once again, both players have 2 bishops, and the bishops go right next to the knights. Just like that. And last but not least is the king. And the king, of course, goes right next to the queen. And finally we have the pawns. Each player has 8 pawns, and the pawns go directly in front of the major pieces. And there you have it. All the major pieces in the pawns are on their starting squares. We'll call this square 1, or the beginning of the game. Now at the beginning of the game, white moves first. But before we do that, let's consider how the pieces and pawns move. First of all, we'll consider the pawns. So to see the pawns more easily, let's move the major pieces out of the way. Okay, now, on the opening move, the pawn can move 1 square or 2 squares. After that, only 1 square, and only in a forward direction. The pawns attack diagonally. Let's watch now as both sides make some opening pawn moves. Now you see white just moved his pawn here, and black's pawn is at a diagonal from that pawn, so black can capture the pawn and put his pawn onto that square. And he does. Now there's a move called en passant, and what that means is if a player moves his pawn 2 squares on the opening move, and that pawn passes through a square that's under attack by the opposing pawn, then the opponent has an option. He can leave it the way it is, or he can capture that pawn and put his pawn on the attacked square. In this situation, black's pawn is here on his 5th rank. So if white moved this pawn 2 squares, he would be passing through this square, which is under attack by that pawn. So black would have an option. He could say en passant and capture it, or he could leave it the way it is. Let's see what he does. And white moved up 2 squares. Black says en passant, captures the pawn, and puts his pawn on the attacked square. Now you can see that white's pawn is at a diagonal from black's pawn. If white was to move this pawn 2 squares on his opening move, that's not an en passant situation. In this situation, white can capture black's pawn. And he does. Now let's watch some more pawn moves. Now you see, white just moved his pawn to his 5th rank, here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if black was to move this pawn or that pawn 2 squares on his opening move, those pawns would pass through a square that's under attack by that pawn. At that point, white would have the option. He could say en passant and capture the pawn, or he could leave it the way it is. Let's see what happens. And black moved up 2 squares. White doesn't say en passant. He captures the pawn with this pawn instead. was to move this pawn 2 squares, white would have the option again of saying en passant or not. Let's see what happens. And black moved up 2 squares. White says en passant, captures that pawn, and places his pawn on the attacked square. Just like that. And right now you can see that black's pawn is at a diagonal from the white pawn, so black could capture that pawn. And he does. I hope the pawn moves are clear. Let's go back to square one and consider the next piece. Next we'll consider the knight, pieces, and pawns. So that we can see the moves a little easier, let's move a knight to the middle of the board. Now the knight moves 2 squares horizontally or vertically, and then 1 square at right angles to that move. Let's watch the white knight move. You see, the knight moved 2 squares, and then he moved 1 square to the left. If you want to think of that as up 1 square, and then at a diagonal 1 square, you see, you can do that. So let's watch the knight move about the board. You see, 1 square, and then add a diagonal. And there is the knight back home. Now the next piece to consider are the bishops. The bishops only stay on the color they start on. Both players have 2 bishops, one on a white square and one on a black square. They'll always remain on these colors because they travel diagonally. Of course, they can't move until the pawns get out of the way. So let's watch how both sides move their pawns out and then get their bishops into the middle of the board. And white moves up 2 squares, and so does black. And white moves his bishop out, and black does the same. And white makes room for his other bishop by moving his pawn out 1 square, here. And black does the same. White brings his bishop out, and black brings his bishop out. But look at this. Black's queen and white's bishop are in line. Black could have captured the white bishop, but he didn't see that. He moved the bishop from here to here. So now it's white's turn, and white's bishop can now attack and capture the queen. And he does. Now if you lose your queen, you don't have much hope to win the game. You see, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. Let's go back to square one and we'll consider the next piece. Now here we are at square one. The next piece to consider is the rook. Now the rooks travel vertically and horizontally. That is, up and down the board or across the board. Let's watch how both sides get their rooks into the middle of the board. And white moves his pawn out, and black does the same. And white moves his rook out, and black does the same. Now you can see that white's rook can travel along this row all the way to the end, which he does. And black also can move his rook all the way across on that row. And he does too. Now, white's rook can capture black's rook, just like that. And now, black's pawn can capture white's rook. You see at a diagonal, the pawns attack diagonally. Also, black's knight can capture the rook. Let's see what black does. And he decided to take it with his pawn. So let's watch now as both sides move their other rooks into the middle of the board. White moves his pawn up, and black moves his knight out, you see what he's going to do is slide his rook over one square, and then he'll be able to move it towards the middle of the board. And here comes white's rook, and black's. White moves again, and so does black. Now white moved his rook here, thinking he could attack this pawn. However, he didn't consider one thing. Can you see that? That's right. This knight can capture white's rook. Just like that. Okay, let's go back to square one, and we'll consider the next piece. Now the next piece to consider is the queen. As I said before, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. The queen can travel in any direction as many squares that are open.